Welcome to the examination of one of the more unsettling documented events in Kentucky's historical record. Before proceeding, I'd encourage you to share in the comments section where you happen to be joining us from, and at what precise time you encountered this narrative. We maintain a certain curiosity about the geographic and temporal distribution of those learning about these particular accounts. There exists a small settlement called Blackwood Junction, positioned within the eastern Kentucky hills, that contemporary maps rarely acknowledge. This omission wasn't merely coincidental. By the winter of 1903, what had once been a community approaching 300 inhabitants had diminished to less than 50 souls. Official county documentation attributes this population reduction to straightforward economic circumstances. However, regional archival materials suggest an alternative explanation. That particular winter fundamentally altered Blackwood Junction's trajectory from promising mining outpost to location deliberately erased from collective memory. The Lexington Herald's preserved records indicate the 1903 winter descended with unusual severity across eastern Kentucky. Freezing temperatures arrived in October and maintained their grip through April. The ground became impenetrably frozen. Waterways solidified, and somewhere within the abandoned Harlan mine, something that should have remained undisturbed began to stir. The mining operation possessed a complicated history predating the infamous winter. Industrialist Edgar Blackwood established it in 1876, initially celebrated as an economic windfall for the surrounding area. The coal proved abundant, prompting rapid expansion. By 1880, over 100 laborers worked the underground passages daily, pushing ever deeper into the mountain's interior. The town naturally developed around this industrial activity: workers' housing, a company store, modest church facilities, and eventually educational accommodations. Blackwood Junction appeared destined for continued growth. Yet each advance deeper underground introduced new complications. County documentation reveals the first peculiar incident occurred in 1883, when 3 miners claimed to have overheard conversations within a newly developed passage. Ordinary discussions about mundane topics, though they were completely alone. The foreman dismissed these reports, suggesting cold damp had affected their perceptions. The affected workers were relocated to different areas. 2 weeks afterward, one of these men vanished during his shift. Investigators discovered his lamp near the very passage where voices had reportedly manifested. The individual himself was never located. This established a recurring pattern over subsequent years, reports of auditory phenomena preceding disappearances. By 1899, these incidents had become sufficiently frequent that laborers refused to work certain underground sections. Extraction rates suffered accordingly. Edgar Blackwood, determined to preserve profitability, recruited outside workers unfamiliar with local narratives, men unexposed to regional superstitions who wouldn't be influenced by such tales. During summer 1902, a partial cave ineffectively sealed the mine's deepest section. Rather than excavating the collapse, Blackwood directed his engineers to develop an alternative tunnel in a different orientation. This decision appeared financially motivated, as clearing the collapse would prove costly. However, certain accounts suggest Blackwood was persuaded by his foreman, who adamantly argued that particular section should remain inaccessible. Correspondence from Blackwood to a Louisville business associate indicates the foreman had developed what he described as unreasonable concerns about conditions in the deepest shaft, characterizing the air there as somehow wrong and the silence as unnaturally complete. 2 months following the new tunnel's activation, a more extensive collapse claimed 12 miners' lives and forced the operation's closure. Official investigators cited inadequate shoring techniques and possible water damage compromising structural supports. Unofficially, survivors reported hearing disembodied conversation immediately preceding the collapse, as though invisible individuals stood among them discussing whether the supports would hold. The mine received an unsafe designation and operations were temporarily suspended. Blackwood remained in the community, residing in his elevated mansion overlooking the settlement, reportedly developing plans to resume extraction once conditions permitted. Those plans never materialized. November 12, 1903 marked the first disappearance that fundamentally altered everything. Dr. Samuel Garfield, the community physician, was observed entering woodland near Ravens Creek after responding to what he believed was an emergency call from an outlying homestead. That call apparently originated from the Blackwood estate, though subsequent inquiry revealed no resident there, admitted to summoning medical assistance. The peculiar aspect of his disappearance extended beyond vanishing without trace. His medical bag was discovered nearly a mile distant, its contents meticulously arranged in a perfect circular pattern on the forest floor. Nothing removed, nothing damaged, simply repositioned. Initial search efforts mobilized the community. Teams scoured the woodland for 3 days before a blizzard forced their retreat. Upon returning, the medical bag had disappeared. The circular arrangement remained, now partially snow-covered, preserved exactly as originally discovered. Sheriff Thomas Harding's official documentation noted it appeared as though someone observed our activities, waiting for our departure before retrieving the bag, while leaving the items undisturbed. What renders this case particularly disturbing is that Garfield commanded not merely respect, but fear throughout Blackwood Junction. Standing 6'4" with substantial physical presence, he was known to single-handedly disperse altercations. Whatever removed him from Blackwood accomplished this, without any indication of struggle. The investigation into Garfield's disappearance received notably quiet handling, excessively quiet according to certain observers. The local newspaper mentioned it once and never again. Community meetings ceased discussing it after the second week. The town appeared to collectively decide on forgetting, though they couldn't forget the sounds. The Blackwood County Register, a weekly publication serving the region until 1948, contains an unusual editorial published November 20, 1903. Though ostensibly addressing winter preparation, it includes this distinctive passage. Citizens are reminded that clear communication is essential during these cold months. Speak plainly and directly. Avoid unnecessary conversation, particularly after dark or in isolated areas. Remember that words once spoken cannot be reclaimed. William Hayes, the newspaper's owner and editor since 1891, authored this piece. Hayes had established a reputation for straightforward reporting, rendering this metaphorical and cautionary language distinctly out of character. More significantly, Hayes ceased publication entirely in mid-December 1903, departing town without explanation. When the Register resumed publication in February 1904 under different ownership, no mention was made of Hayes or his whereabouts. December introduced an acoustic phenomenon defying conventional explanation. Residents reported voices emanating from the abandoned mine shafts. Not cries for assistance or screams, but conversations. Ordinary, everyday discussions as though people discussed weather or routine tasks, yet occurring at unusual hours and from impossible distances. Eleanor Whittaker, the postmistress, documented in her personal journal, hearing her own voice discussing correspondence she had handled earlier that day, despite being completely alone in her residence at the time. Whittaker's journal, discovered during 1949 renovations of the old post office building in neighboring Millfield, where she relocated after departing Blackwood Junction, provides one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the early manifestations. Her December 8, 1903 entry reads, Burned myself again tonight. I was reading by the fire when my own voice came clearly from the kitchen, reciting the address on the Harrow letter exactly as I had read it aloud to myself while sorting mail this morning. When I gathered my courage to investigate, the kitchen was empty. But the voice continued now from the parlor I had just left. It spoke in fragments now. Words and phrases I had used throughout the day, assembled into new sentences that almost made sense but didn't quite. Most disturbing was hearing myself say, "Eleanor knows but won't admit it. I have not spoken those words ever." Subsequent entries document the progression of these experiences. By mid-December, Whittaker reported hearing not just her own voice, but those of other townspeople. Conversations she had witnessed recreated with perfect fidelity hours or days afterward. She began maintaining a log of when and where these acoustic anomalies occurred, noting patterns. They manifested most frequently near dusk, were clearer during snowfall, and often seemed to originate from the mind's direction, regardless of her location within town. The phenomenon proliferated. More residents reported hearing their own voices or private conversations, sometimes days later, echoing from the mines or forest. Sheriff Harding attempted investigation by establishing listening posts throughout town. His deputies reported hearing the sheriff's own voice issuing instructions they'd never received. Deputy Michael Collins provided a particularly detailed statement preserved in county archives. Collins was stationed at the old mill on the town's edge December 18th, tasked with documenting unusual sounds. At approximately 9:17 p.m., he heard Sheriff Harding's voice from within the abandoned structure issuing search pattern orders. Collins, assuming the sheriff had arrived to join him, entered the mill. He found it empty, but reported that the voice continued, now seeming to originate from just behind him, always just out of sight. The voice recited what Collins recognized as instructions Harding had given during a town meeting 3 days earlier, but with significant alterations. Names changed, locations reversed. Collins reported feeling a presence moving around me in the darkness, studying me though I saw nothing. The audio recordings from this period, primitive phonograph cylinders, the sheriff ordered from Louisville, contain only static and occasional rhythmic tapping that University of Kentucky experts determined in 1963 was consistent with human heartbeat patterns. The original recordings were reportedly destroyed in a 1967 courthouse fire, though analysis transcripts remain in university archives. Professor Alan Thornton, who led the analysis, noted several anomalies in his report. The rhythmic patterns exhibited variations that initially appeared random, but when graphed over time, displayed a clear mathematical progression, as though something was experimenting with the patterns, methodically testing variations. More disturbing was Thornton's observation that the final cylinder in the sequence contained a pattern identical to the human heartbeat, but impossibly precise, as though created by a machine attempting to replicate the organic irregularities of a human heart. Thornton's conclusion was that the recordings were elaborate hoaxes, though he couldn't explain how such sophisticated acoustic patterns could have been created with the technology available in 1903. By January 1903, Blackwood Junction had transformed. Residents began avoiding each other. Public conversations ceased almost entirely. Church attendance dropped to zero. According to store receipts preserved in the County Historical Society, purchases of locks, bolts, and weapons increased by 300%. Most tellingly, no one ventured out after sunset. Store ledgers from this period show another unusual pattern, a sharp increase in the purchase of materials that might dampen sound. Heavy curtains, wool batting, even egg crates, which some residents apparently used to line their walls. Several orders were placed for phonographs and musical cylinders despite their considerable expense. Interviews with descendants of survivors suggest these were used not for entertainment, but to mask conversation, creating background noise to prevent private discussions from being heard and potentially repeated. The winter isolation might explain some behavioral changes, but not the collective silence that descended on Blackwood Junction. Residents began covering mirrors, stuffing rags under doors, and hanging thick curtains over windows. Several accounts mention people would speak only in whispers, if at all, believing that voices spoken aloud would return later from the darkness. The town's lone telephone operator, Harriet Wilcox, noted in her logbook that calls dropped precipitously in January. When people did use the telephone, their conversations were cryptic and brief. Several refused to speak at all, using a system of taps to communicate. 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, patterns for simple messages. According to Wilcox's notes, this was due to a growing belief that the telephone wires carried voices too far into places where something might be listening. What happened to Edgar Blackwood, patriarch of the founding family, exemplifies the psychological terror that gripped the town. A wealthy industrialist who had established the mining operation in 1876, Blackwood lived in a mansion overlooking the town. His personal physician, Dr. Morrison, who replaced Garfield, noted in his medical log that Blackwood began experiencing auditory disruptions in mid-January. Before his own troubles began, Blackwood had remained skeptical of the town's growing hysteria. In letters to business associates in Louisville, he described the situation as a regrettable mass delusion, likely triggered by the difficult winter and the unfortunate disappearance of Dr. Garfield. He even hosted a dinner party on January 7th, inviting the town's remaining officials and prominent citizens. According to Morrison's notes, only 3 people attended, and the evening was marked by strained silence, interrupted by the host's increasingly desperate attempts at conversation. The log, discovered during a renovation of the county courthouse in 1951, describes how Blackwood initially complained of hearing mining operations at night, though the mine had been closed since an accident the previous summer. These complaints escalated to hearing board meetings he'd conducted years earlier, complete with voices of partners who had died or left the region. Morrison's records become increasingly detailed as Blackwood's condition deteriorated. The industrialist reported that the replayed conversations began to include questions he had never asked and answers he had never given. Business discussions morphed into personal matters, secrets Blackwood claimed never to have uttered aloud. Most distressingly, he began hearing conversations between himself and his deceased wife, discussing events that had occurred after her death. Morrison prescribed laudanum for sleep and suggested Blackwood leave town temporarily. Blackwood refused. His final journal entry dated January 28, 1903 reads simply, "They are not echoes. They are rehearsals." Among Blackwood's papers, discovered decades later in a bank vault in Louisville, was a sealed envelope containing what appeared to be transcripts of conversations. The handwriting matches Blackwood's known script, but the content is bizarre. Dialogues between Blackwood and various townspeople discussing events that had not yet occurred at the time of writing. These include detailed descriptions of spring flooding that would indeed affect the region in April 1903, references to the Spanish-American War that contained details not public until years later, and most disturbingly accurate accounts of how and when certain residents would die, including some who disappeared that winter. The final pages are increasingly incoherent, with multiple versions of Blackwood's handwriting overlapping on the same page, as if different versions of himself were attempting to communicate simultaneously. The last legible phrase written in a hand barely recognizable as Blackwood's reads. I hear myself planning this from the mine. I've been practicing me. He disappeared the following night. The mansion was found immaculate, no signs of struggle or forced entry. The only anomaly was that every timepiece in the house, from grandfather clocks to pocket watches, had stopped at 3:27 a.m. According to the household staff, the mansion felt wrong afterward. The cook described it as a place where the air itself was listening. What's particularly notable about Blackwood's disappearance is how little attention it received outside the town. Despite his prominence in Kentucky business circles, his absence went unremarked in Louisville and Lexington newspapers. Inquiries from business partners were reportedly answered with letters explaining that Blackwood had traveled abroad for health reasons. These letters, when examined decades later, proved to be forgeries, though the handwriting was indistinguishable from Blackwood's own. The investigation into Blackwood's disappearance was more thorough than Garfield's had been. State authorities were notified. Records from the Kentucky State Police indicate a detective named James Monroe arrived on February 3rd to investigate. His initial reports described the town as pathologically silent and noted that residents appeared uniformly haggard and unwilling to maintain eye contact. Monroe's personal journal, which was not included in official records, but was preserved by his widow and later donated to the State Historical Society, provides a more candid assessment of the situation. His entry from February 4th reads, "Something is profoundly wrong in Blackwood Junction. The residents move like sleepwalkers. They watch me when they think I'm not looking, but won't meet my gaze directly. They speak as little as possible, and when they do, they whisper or write notes they immediately destroy. They seem not afraid of each other, but of themselves, of what might come out of their own mouths. I've never seen fear like this." Monroe's investigation centered on the abandoned mine. His reports detail an unusual discovery. Despite being shut down for months, the mine entrance showed signs of recent activity. Boot prints led both in and out, though they matched no resident's footwear. More disturbing were the handprints found on the support beams. Handprints that Monroe noted were positioned as if someone had been dragged into the darkness while trying to resist. In his journal, Monroe described his examination of the mine entrance. The prints are peculiar, almost but not quite human. The stride length is inconsistent, as if whatever made them was unused to walking. And there's a deliberateness to them, each print placed with unnatural precision, like a child practicing steps. The handprints trouble me more. They begin at adult height, but drag downward, growing more frantic. Several fingers appear to have broken during the struggle, leaving smears rather than prints toward the end. The detective requested permission to explore the mine shaft, but was denied by state authorities who cited structural concerns. Private correspondence between Monroe and his superior, preserved in the state archives, reveals his frustration. Something is happening in Blackwood Junction that defies rational explanation. The residents know more than they're saying, but they've developed a pathological fear of speaking. I believe this community is suffering from a shared psychosis, triggered by isolation and possibly exacerbated by environmental factors. Monroe's journal entries become increasingly concerned with his own experiences as the investigation continued. He began recording instances of hearing conversations repeated, discussions he had with townspeople echoing from empty rooms hours later. He noted waking at exactly 3:27 a.m. 3 nights in a row, feeling observed by something in the room's darkest corner. Most troubling was his growing conviction that his own voice no longer sounded right to his ears, that something in its timbre had changed. Monroe never filed his final report, According to the last telegram he sent to headquarters on February 12th, he planned one final interview with the town's schoolmaster who claimed to have information about what the mine took. Monroe was never seen again. His horse was found grazing calmly outside the schoolhouse. His notebook opened on the teacher's desk. The pages were blank. What's particularly disturbing about Monroe's disappearance is the testimony of Abigail Winters, the schoolmaster's elderly mother. In a statement given to the state police, she claimed to have observed Monroe approach the schoolhouse at exactly 4:15 p.m. According to her account, he tied his horse outside, straightened his hat, and entered the building. 17 minutes later, she saw him exit again, mount his horse, and ride toward the mine. When investigators pointed out that his horse had been found still tied at the schoolhouse, she became agitated, insisting she had seen what she had seen. It was him. Her statement reads, but not quite right. He walked too careful, like he was learning how. Mrs. Winters's statement includes another detail that investigators initially dismissed, but gains significance in light of the broader pattern. She claimed that, as Monroe rode away, she clearly heard his voice from inside the schoolhouse, engaged in conversation with her son. Two voices, she insisted, both the detectives, but having different conversations in different rooms. The schoolmaster himself, Jonathan Winters, was found in the school cellar, hiding in a coal bin. When discovered, he was engaged in what appeared to be a conversation with himself, whispering questions, and then answering in a slightly different tone. He resisted being removed from the cellar and became violent when forced to leave. During his transport to the state hospital in Lexington, he escaped by jumping from the moving train. Despite an extensive search, he was never found. A railroad worker reported seeing a man matching Winters's description, walking calmly along the tracks toward Blackwood Junction hours after his escape, but this sighting was never confirmed. The state police sent 2 more detectives to investigate Monroe's disappearance. They reported finding the town depopulated, though no evacuation had been ordered or reported. Approximately 30 residents remained, all claiming the others had moved on for better opportunities. Those who stayed appeared, in the words of Detective Franklin Reed, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Reed's official reports maintain a professional detachment, presenting observations without speculation. His private letters to his wife, however, preserved in her family collection and made available to researchers in 1987, revealed growing unease. He described residents who seemed emptied out, not just frightened or withdrawn, but somehow incomplete. He noted the town's unnatural quiet, writing that even the usual sounds of habitation, footsteps, doors closing, dishes clinking, are absent, as if people are making a conscious effort to move without sound. Most disturbing was his account of interviewing remaining residents. They answer questions mechanically with phrases that sound rehearsed. When pressed for details, they repeat themselves exactly using identical words and gestures, as if they've learned a script, but can't improvise beyond it. Their eyes remain fixed on points just over my shoulder, as if they're watching for something I can't see. The most disturbing account comes from Reed's partner, Detective Samuel Porter, who documented a strange incident during their second night in town. While staying at the boarding house, Porter reported waking to find his partner standing motionless at the window, staring toward the mine. When Porter spoke to him, Reed didn't respond. According to Porter's report, Reed finally turned and said, "They're coming back wrong," before returning to bed. Reed had no recollection of the incident the next morning. Porter's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1945 and now held in the Kentucky State Police Museum, elaborates on this incident. Reed's face was wrong, somehow slack in a way I've never seen on a conscious person. His eyes tracked my movement, but showed no recognition. When he spoke, the words came too slowly, with unnatural pauses between them, as if he were translating from another language. I asked him what he meant. He turned back to the window and said, "They practice us until they get it right." He then returned to his bed with a stiff, careful gait, unlike his usual stride. This morning, he remembers nothing, but something has changed. He doesn't sound quite like himself anymore. The detective's investigation centered on interviewing the remaining residents who provided contradictory and often nonsensical accounts of the previous weeks. Several mentioned hearing the wrong voices saying the right things. Others refused to speak at all, communicating only through written notes that they immediately burned after being read. One interview with former mine foreman George Latimer was particularly revealing. Latimer, who had worked in the mine for 22 years before the collapse, initially refused to speak at all. When Porter insisted, Latimer wrote a note. "They learn from hearing us. They're better at it now." When asked to explain, Latimer reluctantly whispered, "It started in the new tunnel. We broke through into something hollow, bigger than it should have been." The echo was wrong there, too clear, too precise, like something was catching our words and holding them. Then, they started coming back changed. Latimer claimed the miners had encountered a natural cavity, deep within the mountain. A space that should have been solid rock, but instead was empty in a way that felt wrong. He described how voices in this chamber would return not as simple echoes, but as responses, often incorporating words spoken days earlier, in completely different contexts. Several miners reported hearing their own private conversations repeated in this space, including discussions that had occurred at home far from the mine. Most disturbing was Latimer's claim that some miners began hearing versions of themselves, discussing accidents that had not yet happened, accurate premonitions of cave-ins or equipment failures. After a while, he whispered, "We realized it wasn't predicting accidents. It was planning them." The mine itself became the focus of local superstition. Residents avoided looking directly at the entrance, which was visible from the town's main street. Several had boarded up windows facing that direction. The local minister, Reverend Hollister, began preaching that the mine was a mouth that should be sewn shut. His sermons, transcribed by his wife and preserved in the church records, speak of words that return changed in voices that learn from listening. Hollister's theological interpretation of events evolved over the winter months. Initial sermons framed the phenomena as divine tests or possibly demonic influence. By January, his rhetoric had shifted to something more unusual, describing the mine as a place where the fabric between is worn thin and warning that what listens from that hollow is neither divine nor demonic, but something outside such categories altogether. It learns, it imitates, and eventually it replaces. His final sermon, delivered to a nearly empty church on February 1st, abandoned religious framework entirely. The transcript reads more like a warning. It begins with your voice, because that's the easiest part of you to capture. The part that extends beyond your body into the world. Once it has your voice, it studies how you move, how you think, how you respond. It practices being you. And when it's confident, it steps into your place. The body remains as a shell, moving through familiar patterns. But what animates it is no longer the person you knew. Hollister and his wife disappeared 3 days later. Their home was found in perfect order, a cold breakfast still on the table. The only anomaly was a partial transcript of a sermon in Hollister's handwriting discussing events that had not yet occurred, including a detailed description of investigators finding his abandoned home. Reed and Porter eventually requested permission to seal the mine entrance. State authorities, concerned about valuable equipment still inside, initially refused. The detectives' increasingly urgent telegrams, however, eventually convinced them. On February 22, 1903, a controlled explosion collapsed the mine entrance. Porter's report indicates the collapse was met with no celebration from townspeople, only a collective exhalation, as if the town had been holding its breath for months. The relief was short-lived. That night, according to multiple witness statements, every resident reported hearing a clear, distinct knocking, 3 slow raps from inside their homes. The sounds came from walls, floors, ceilings, seemingly everywhere and nowhere. Several residents fled that night, leaving behind everything they owned. What's particularly noteworthy about the exodus is how it was conducted. According to Porter's report, those who fled did so in absolute silence. No calls to family members, no shouted instructions, no crying or expressions of panic. They simply walked out of their homes and away from town, carrying nothing, speaking to no one. Several walked right past Porter without acknowledging him, their expressions blank yet purposeful. He described them as moving like sleepwalkers, with somewhere specific to be. Porter observed another disturbing pattern. Those who left walked not toward the main road or nearby towns, but toward the collapsed mine entrance. His attempts to redirect several residents failed. They simply walked around him and continued their journey. He followed one woman for nearly a mile before she disappeared into the tree line near the mine. Search parties the next day found no trace of those who had fled. Those who remained began behaving even more strangely. Reed documented several instances of residents appearing to have conversations with empty chairs, moving their lips but producing no sound. Others would freeze in mid-motion, remaining absolutely still for minutes at a time before continuing as if nothing had happened. The town Dr. Morrison began diagnosing these episodes as temporal fugues, moments where he claimed the mind steps briefly outside of time. Reed observed that these episodes often occurred simultaneously among multiple residents as if coordinated. In one instance, he documented 5 people in different locations around town, freezing at precisely the same moment, remaining motionless for exactly 7 minutes, and then resuming activity as if nothing had happened. When questioned, none reported any awareness of the pause. Morrison's medical records from this period show a preoccupation with silence as a diagnostic tool. He began requiring patients to sit in complete silence for 10 minutes before he would examine them, claiming this allowed him to hear what's really wrong. His notes become increasingly erratic through February, filled with observations like, "Mrs. Thornton's cough has a conversational rhythm," and "Judge Williams's pulse is asking questions." Most disturbing was Morrison's growing conviction that diseases themselves were forms of communication, that symptoms were messages from elsewhere using the human body as a medium. His treatment protocols began to include acoustic isolation for patients whom he would place in specially constructed chambers lined with sound-absorbing materials. According to his notes, this was to prevent the illness from hearing itself and learning how to evolve. By March, Blackwood Junction had fewer than 20 residents. Those who remained rarely ventured outdoors and never spoke above a whisper. The Postal Service stopped delivering mail after the postmistress left without notice, her office locked from the inside with no sign of her within. The general store operated on an honor system. Customers would take what they needed and leave payment, without the proprietor ever showing himself. Reed and Porter's reports from this period document a community in profound psychological distress. Residents had developed elaborate systems to avoid making sound, wrapping doorknobs in cloth, wearing multiple layers of socks instead of shoes, communicating through gesture and written notes. Many had taken to wearing scarves or high collars that obscured their mouths, even indoors. The psychological state of the remaining residents deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Morrison's medical log shows increasing cases of extreme insomnia, paranoia, and what he termed echoasia, a condition where patients would only communicate by repeating what was said to them as if afraid to generate original speech. Morrison's own mental state declined precipitously in early March. His medical notes, initially clinical and organized, devolved into rambling observations about acoustic infections and mimetic contagions. He became convinced that something was using sound itself as a vector, that the human voice could be colonized by an external entity. His final entries describe attempts to develop a vocal vaccine, having patients listen to recordings of their own voices played backward, which he believed would confuse the mimics. The most detailed account from this period comes from Margaret Weston, a nurse who arrived from Lexington to assist Dr. Morrison. Her journal, discovered in 1957 in the Kentucky Medical Historical Society archives, describes a community in the grip of collective psychosis. Residents would freeze at unexpected sounds. Some had taken to walking only on carpeted areas to avoid making footsteps. Most disturbing was their habit of mouthing words without vocalizing them, communicating through exaggerated lip movements while remaining completely silent. Weston's observations about the physical changes in residents are particularly unsettling. She noted that many appeared to have lost significant weight, not from lack of food, but from what she described as a hollowing out. Their skin hung loosely, their eyes seemed deeper set. Their voices, when they used them, had a resonant quality she compared to speaking into an empty barrel. She began to suspect some form of wasting disease until she noticed that certain residents appeared to be regaining weight and vitality at night, only to return to their hollowed state by morning. Her journal entries from mid-March document a growing concern that the residents were not actually sleeping. She observed lights moving in houses throughout the night, shadows passing windows at odd hours, and reported hearing what sounded like conversations at 3:27 a.m., always at that precise time, though the voices were too faint to make out words. When she questioned residents, they insisted they had slept soundly and alone, despite Weston having clearly seen multiple moving shadows in their homes. Her journal entries grow increasingly concerned about Dr. Morrison, who had begun what he called acoustic treatments. These involved placing patients in the root cellar, beneath his office for hours at a time, claiming the perfect silence would reset their inner voices. Patients emerged disoriented and even more reluctant to speak. One patient, whom Weston identifies only as Mr. H, emerged from treatment unable or unwilling to speak at all. When she examined him, she found his vocal cords appeared to be functioning normally, but he responded to questions by writing, "I gave it my voice. It was the only way to make it stop." Weston's professional skepticism gradually eroded as she experienced increasingly inexplicable phenomena herself. She documented hearing her own voice reciting patient notes in rooms she had just left, seeing her reflection in mirrors continue moving after she had stopped, and most disturbingly finding pages in her journal filled with her handwriting describing events that had not yet happened. One entry dated March 17th, but apparently written earlier, detailed with perfect accuracy a conversation she would have with Morrison on that date, including phrases and observations she had never considered before reading them in her own handwriting. "It's as if something else is using my hand, my words, my thoughts, but from hours or days ahead of when I actually experience them." Weston lasted 2 weeks before fleeing. Her final journal entry describes waking to find Morrison standing over her bed, silently mouthing words she couldn't understand. When she asked what he wanted, he placed a finger to his lips and wrote on a piece of paper, "They're learning to imitate us. Don't give them your voice." The following morning, Morrison was gone. His home was undisturbed, except for a peculiar detail. Every reflective surface had been covered with black cloth. What Weston didn't include in her journal, but later confided to a colleague at the Lexington hospital. According to a letter found in the colleague's personal effects after her death, was that she had been experiencing auditory phenomena herself before fleeing. She described waking in the night to hear her own voice reciting patient notes she had recorded earlier, though the phonograph she used to record them was not playing. More disturbing, she claimed to hear her own voice speaking phrases she had only thought, but never said aloud. This progression from hearing one's own voice repeat spoken words to that had never been vocalized appears repeatedly in accounts from Blackwood Junction. It suggests whatever was learning from residents was becoming more sophisticated in its mimicry, moving from simple repetition to more complex forms of simulation. April brought spring to Kentucky, but no renewal to Blackwood Junction. The remaining residents began reporting a phenomenon more disturbing than the voices. They described seeing themselves in places they hadn't been, glimpsed through windows, around corners, always at a distance, always just for a moment. Sheriff Harding, one of the few officials who remained, documented these sightings in his official log, noting that they followed a pattern. Residents would see their doppelgangers 3 times before disappearing themselves. Harding's log entries from early April attempt to maintain an objective tone, documenting each reported sighting with time, location, and witness statements. By April 7th, the entries become more personal. Harding himself reported seeing his double standing at the edge of the forest at 4:17 p.m. His log entry is clinical, detailing the time, the exact location, and the fact that the figure was wearing his winter coat, though the day was mild. Harding's description is disturbing in its precision. He noted that his doppelganger stood too still, maintaining a posture that would be difficult for a living person to hold. When Harding called out, the figure turned with mechanical deliberateness, rotating its head first, then its torso in a separate motion. It made no response, but observed him for several minutes before stepping backward into the tree line and vanishing. Harding reported finding no footprints or disturbed vegetation where it had stood. His second sighting came on April 12th. This time his double was closer, standing in the middle of the town square at dusk, facing the mine. In this encounter, the doppelganger was wearing Harding's sheriff's uniform and badge. Harding reported that when he approached, the figure began to speak not to him, but as if practicing speech. It cycled through greetings and common phrases. He wrote using my voice but with subtle variations in inflection, as if testing different emotional tones. "Good morning. How are you today? Fine weather we're having." Each repeated several times with slight adjustments. What Harding found most unnerving was not the duplication of his appearance or voice, but the sense that the doppelganger was practicing being me, rehearsing human interaction like an actor preparing for a role. When he drew his revolver, the figure displayed no fear or concern, merely tilting its head like a curious bird before walking away with movements that seemed almost but not quite right, as if working from observation rather than innate understanding. The final entry in Harding's log, dated April 15th, contains just one line. "He's standing outside my window now, wearing my badge. He's waited long enough." Harding's badge was found on his desk the next morning. He was never seen again. What's particularly disturbing about Harding's case is the testimony of Joseph Miller, one of the few townspeople still willing to speak to outsiders. In a statement given to county officials who briefly investigated in late April, Miller claimed to have seen Harding walking toward the mine the morning after his disappearance. Miller, assuming the sheriff had returned, called out to him. According to his statement, Harding turned, nodded, but didn't speak. Miller described feeling immediately uneasy, though he couldn't articulate why. It was Harding, he stated, but he moved wrong. Too deliberate, like he was thinking about each step. And his eyes, they were watching me, but nothing was behind them. Miller's statement includes a detail that investigators initially dismissed, but takes on greater significance in light of later events. He claimed that as Harding walked away, he noticed that the sheriff's footsteps made no sound despite his heavy boots and the gravel road. When Miller looked down, he saw that Harding's feet weren't quite touching the ground. The county investigation was brief and inconclusive. Officials attributed the multiple disappearances and bizarre accounts to mountain fever and possibly contaminated water. Their report recommended abandoning the settlement due to unsuitable living conditions. No mention was made of the acoustic phenomena or the doppelganger sightings, despite multiple witness statements describing both. By May 1903, Blackwood Junction was officially abandoned. The county listed it as economically non-viable, and no effort was made to resettle the area. The buildings remained slowly decaying over the decades. The mine entrance, despite being collapsed, was reinforced with concrete in 1927 under the authorization of the state governor, though no official explanation was recorded. The authorization for the reinforcement came after a series of unusual incidents in the region. Hunters reported hearing conversations emanating from the collapsed mine entrance, conversations in voices they recognized from town residents who had disappeared years earlier. More disturbing were reports from nearby communities that former Blackwood Junction residents had been seen returning to the abandoned town, often at night, walking in a trance-like state toward the mine. A state ranger tasked with monitoring the area in 1926-27 kept a detailed log of these returns. He documented 17 instances over an 8-month period, noting that the returnees displayed common characteristics, moving with unusual stiffness, never speaking, and traveling only after sunset. His attempts to intercept several were unsuccessful. The figures would change direction to avoid him, always maintaining their trajectory toward the mine, circling around obstacles if necessary. The ranger's most disturbing observation was that these returning figures left no footprints, even in soft ground, and seemed unaffected by environmental conditions. One elderly woman he observed walking toward the mine during a heavy rainstorm remained completely dry, despite having no umbrella or coat. When he shouted at her, she turned to look at him, with what he described as perfect emptiness, eyes as vacant as glass marbles before continuing her journey. The concrete seal was designed not just to prevent entry into the mine, but according to private correspondence between the governor and the project engineer, to prevent sound transmission in either direction. The engineer's reports indicate that special acoustic dampening materials were incorporated into the concrete mixture, an unusual and expensive addition that was not disclosed in public records. The project faced unexpected difficulties. Workers reported tools disappearing only to be found arranged in careful patterns.